From one clay jar, sealed the old way, a family could eat real pork through an entire winter with no refrigerator, no freezer, and no electricity at all. This is a technique that traces back more than 2,000 years to farmers in the mountains of Sichuan, China, who had exactly one window each year, right after the cold set in, to preserve enough meat to survive the months that followed. No second chances, no backup plan. Get the jar wrong, and a family went hungry before spring. I'm Amelia, and today I'm recreating this jar exactly the way it was built centuries ago, using only what a household back then actually had access to. And at the end, I'm showing you the one sealing detail that decides whether this jar lasts. From one clay jar, sealed the old way, a family could eat real pork through an entire winter with no refrigerator, no freezer, and no electricity at all. This is a technique that traces back more than 2,000 years to farmers in the mountains of Sichuan, China, who had exactly one window each year, right after the cold set in, to preserve enough meat to survive the months that followed. No second chances, no backup plan. Get the jar wrong, and a family went hungry before spring. I'm Amelia, and today I'm recreating this jar exactly the way it was built centuries ago, using only what a household back then actually had access to. And at the end, I'm showing you the one sealing detail that decides whether this jar lasts through an entire season or turns to waste in a matter of days. Let's get into it. I'm starting with pork belly, about 2 pounds, skin still on. Why this cut and not something leaner like loin or tenderloin? Because in this technique, fat isn't a byproduct you trim away and discard. Fat is the entire preservation system. Once rendered down, that fat becomes liquid lard, and lard does two jobs here at once. It's the cooking medium the pork fries in, and later it becomes the physical seal that closes the jar off from the outside world. Lean cuts have almost nothing to contribute to that second job. They dry out under long cooking, they crack along the surface, and worst of all, they leave you short on fat, which means gaps in the jar where air can sit undisturbed. Pork belly gives you the ratio this recipe actually needs. Enough muscle for real protein, enough fat to carry flavor deep into the meat, and still have plenty left over to seal the entire jar shut from above. I cut the belly into chunks, roughly 1.5 inches each. Consistent sizing matters here for the same reason it matters in almost every preservation recipe. Smaller, uneven pieces fry through unevenly. Some edges will render fully while thicker centers stay undercooked, and an undercooked center is exactly where spoilage gets its first foothold weeks later. Keeping every piece close to the same size means every piece finishes rendering at roughly the same time, which means no weak points hiding inside the jar once it's sealed. I season the pork by hand, working in salt, a little ground Sichuan pepper, and a touch of fresh ginger into every surface. Salt is doing two separate jobs at once here. First, it's pulling moisture out from inside the meat toward the surface through basic osmosis. Second, that surface moisture then evaporates during the fry, and less residual moisture on the outside of the meat means a much smaller window for bacteria to establish themselves once the meat goes into the jar. Into a hot wok with just enough oil to get the render started. Medium-high heat, deliberately, not the blazing maximum heat you'd use for a quick sear. This isn't a fast crust and done step like searing beef for the freezer. This is a slow, patient fry, because the goal here is completely different. I want the fat inside each piece of pork to melt out gradually into the wok, while the exterior slowly deepens into a dark golden brown. That color change is the Maillard reaction at work, the exact same chemical process behind the crust on a good steak, or the dark crust competitor recipes chase on beef and pork, sugars and proteins, rearranging under sustained heat into hundreds of new flavor compounds. But here, that crust is doing something extra beyond flavor. It's partially sealing the exterior of every piece of meat before it even reaches the jar. The same underlying logic behind searing meat before long-term freezing, just carried on for far longer, 20 to 25 minutes total, until the pork is sitting fully submerged in its own rendered fat. While that render is happening slowly in the background, I'm working on the half of this recipe almost nobody outside this region thinks to include: traditional preserved vegetables, usually mustard greens or a heartier cabbage, that have already been salted and left to ferment for several days before this recipe even starts. I'm chopping a generous handful into rough pieces. These aren't filler, and they aren't just there for texture or contrast against the richness of the pork. Preserved vegetables like this carry live lactic acid bacteria, the exact same family of microorganisms responsible for kimchi, for real fermented sauerkraut, for a genuine barrel fermented dill pickle. When you layer these vegetables directly into the jar alongside the meat, that fermentation doesn't stop once the jar is sealed. It keeps going, slowly, quietly, producing lactic acid as a natural byproduct over the following weeks. That acid steadily lowers the pH inside the sealed jar. A lower pH is hostile ground for the organisms responsible for spoilage, and critically, it's hostile ground specifically for the bacteria behind botulism, which needs a low oxygen, low acid environment to grow, exactly the environment a sealed jar would otherwise provide on its own. This fermented vegetable layer is the single most commonly skipped part of this recipe when people try to recreate it from memory, and skipping it is a real mistake, because without it you're relying entirely on fat as your only barrier, and fat alone was never meant to carry that job by itself. Drop a comment below if you've ever eaten a fermented vegetable you made yourself at home. I'm genuinely curious how many people watching already have something fermenting quietly in a jar in their kitchen right now without ever thinking of it as a preservation technique in its own right. The pork is ready. Deep amber all the way through, fully rendered, sitting in a shallow pool of its own fat at the bottom of the wok. I lift the pieces out with a slotted spoon and set them aside to rest for a moment, and I do not throw out that fat, not a spoonful of it. That rendered lard is the single most valuable output of this entire cooking process. Historically, in the region this recipe comes from, a household would reuse rendered lard like this across months, sometimes across an entire year, because producing it took real time, real fuel, and real meat, and none of those three were something a family in that era could afford to waste on a whim. Now the jar itself. I'm using a traditional double-walled ceramic jar, the kind still handmade in parts of Sichuan today, though a heavy, deep ceramic vessel with a tight-fitting lid will get you most of the way there if you don't have access to the traditional version. I start by pressing a layer of the fermented vegetables into the bottom, using the back of a large spoon to compact them down firmly. Firm packing matters here more than it might look like it should, because air pockets are the real enemy at every stage of this jar. Any gap left filled with air is a gap where oxygen-loving spoilage bacteria can sit completely undisturbed, untouched by either the acid from the vegetables or the fat sealing the top. On top of that vegetable layer goes a layer of fried pork, then another layer of vegetables, then more pork again, repeating and pressing down firmly after every single layer until the jar sits nearly full, with just enough headroom left at the top for what comes next. Here is the step that decides everything, the one I promised you at the very beginning. I pour the still warm rendered lard slowly over the top of the packed jar, letting it seep down through every layer beneath it, filling any remaining gaps between pieces, until it settles into a completely solid, unbroken layer of fat, sitting above the food line once it cools. This fat cap is the actual secret behind this whole technique. It isn't the pork, and it isn't the fermented vegetables working alone. It's this complete gapless cap of solid fat sitting on top, and it has one specific job: physically cutting the food underneath off from oxygen entirely. No oxygen, combined with the steadily rising acidity from the fermenting vegetables below, creates an environment where the organisms responsible for spoilage simply can't get established in the first place. Skip this step. or leave even one small section of the surface exposed to open air, and mold will find that exact spot first, usually within about a week. And once mold takes hold anywhere along an exposed edge, the safe move is to treat the entire jar as compromised, not just the visible patch, because you have no way of knowing how far underneath the surface it's already spread. The traditional double-walled version of this jar takes the seal one full step further, and this is worth understanding even if you're using a simpler container at home. The outer wall of the jar holds a narrow moat of water running around the rim where the inner lid sits. That ring of water blocks airflow into the jar completely, without needing a rubber gasket or a modern screw-top seal at all. It's the same basic principle Sichuan pickle jars have relied on for generations to keep fermentation vessels anaerobic, using nothing more complicated than water and gravity. If you don't have a jar built this way, a heavy lid pressed down tightly over the solid fat cap, then stored somewhere consistently cool, dark, and undisturbed, will get you most of that same protective effect, just with noticeably less margin for error if the seal shifts even slightly. Historically, families in this part of Sichuan stored jars exactly like this one in cool stone cellars or unheated back rooms through the coldest stretch of the year, and the oral tradition passed down through the region holds that a properly sealed jar, kept reliably cold the entire time, could stay good well past a single winter, in some family accounts as long as 2 years. That specific claim comes from generations of household experience and passed down tradition, not from a modern food safety laboratory. And it depended entirely on two things holding steady the whole time: the seal never breaking and the storage space staying consistently cold and dry without interruption. A jar built at this size yields somewhere around 10 to 12 full servings, depending on how generous each portion is. Nutritionally, a single serving of pork prepared and stored this way carries somewhere in the range of 20 to 25 grams of protein, along with a meaningful contribution of vitamin B12, zinc, and iron, all naturally present in pork to begin with, and further concentrated here because almost none of the fat or juices are lost the way they would be with boiling, steaming, or any wetter cooking method. The fermented vegetables layered in alongside the pork aren't only contributing to the preservation chemistry either. They're carrying their own naturally occurring probiotics from the fermentation process itself, along with a noticeable amount of vitamin C, most of which actually survives here, specifically because those vegetables were never exposed to high heat at any point. Now, the moment of truth. I'm opening a jar that has been sealed and resting undisturbed for several weeks. I break through the solid fat cap with the edge of a spoon, and right away you can hear it, a small release of pressure as the seal gives way, which tells you the anaerobic environment inside was actually doing its job the entire time it sat sealed. Underneath that broken fat layer, the pork is sitting exactly as it went in, deep amber, glistening, fully submerged, until the moment I lifted the first piece out. The smell that rises up out of the jar is rich and distinctly savory, carrying a sharp fermented edge from the vegetables layered underneath, and nothing about it resembles the smell of spoilage. No sourness pointing in the wrong direction, no sharp ammonia note anywhere, just clean fermented tang sitting under the weight of rendered pork fat. I scoop a portion straight into a hot pan, along with a small handful of the preserved vegetables pulled from that same layer, no added oil needed since the pork brings more than enough of its own. A minute or two over medium heat, and the fat begins to shimmer again, exactly the way it looked the day this jar was first sealed shut. The pork itself is tender, nearly falling apart along the edges, carrying the same deep savory character the long fry built into it weeks earlier, while the fermented vegetables cut straight through that richness with a clean, sharp contrast on the other side. Served over plain steamed rice, this becomes a full, complete meal in the exact time it takes rice to finish steaming, built entirely from a jar that needed nothing more than a cool corner of a room to stay good from the day it was sealed until the day it was opened. This is the same basic principle every real long-term preservation technique in this style eventually comes back to, whether the barrier is salt, fat, cold, or acid. You never rely on just one of them alone. You stack two or three together, so if any single barrier weakens even slightly over time, the others are still standing guard behind